This is I-24 News, and I'm Natasha Kirchak. Thanks for joining us. It is day 24 of the war between the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel, and the United States, and everyone is now asking, are we suddenly on the brink of a deal to end one of the most dangerous wars in the region? Well, U.S. President Donald Trump says the United States and Iran are now engaged in what he is calling very productive talks that could lead to a complete resolution of the conflict and possibly within days. He claims that Tehran may be ready to give up enriched uranium, abandon any pursuit of nuclear weapons, and even agree to broader terms that would bring long-term stability, saying that such a deal would make Israel very happy. But Iran is pushing back hard. Officials in Tehran insist that no negotiations are taking place, with Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf dismissing the reports as fake news and accusing Washington of trying to manipulate global oil markets. The mixed messaging comes as Trump says he has postponed planned U.S. strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure for 5 days to give diplomacy more time, even while Israeli and American military operations continue elsewhere. And behind the scenes, regional powers like Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan are reportedly working to mediate while global markets are reacting in real time. We've seen oil prices briefly plunging on hopes that the Strait of Hormuz could reopen if a deal is reached. Israeli officials have so far stayed largely silent, although signals suggest that Jerusalem is being kept informed. And here's what Trump had to say just about an hour ago at a task force roundtable in Memphis.
So we are now having really good discussions. They started last night, a little bit, the night before that. And I think they're very good. They want peace. They've agreed they will not have a nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll see. You have to get it done. But I would say there's a very good chance. And it began when I said that we were planning tomorrow on shooting down some of their power plants, and we're going to hold that up. Hopefully we won't have to do it. And hopefully we can make a deal that's good for all of us, including the Middle Eastern allies that have been very good to us, including Israel, that's been a great partner in this fight. They've really been a good partner in the fight. They fought hard. But we'll see what happens. I think there's a very good chance we're going to end up in a deal. And so we're giving it 5 days, and then we're going to see where that takes us. And I would say at the end of this period, I think it could very well end up being a very good deal for everybody.
Joining us now is our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, who joins us from the White House. Mike, how seriously should we take President Trump's claims that a deal with Iran is close, especially when we're seeing Tehran publicly denying that any negotiations are even happening?
What do the people around President Trump always say? Take him seriously, but not literally? That's how seriously we should take him right now. There's obviously something to what President Trump is saying. I don't think he's pulling this out of thin air. There is obviously a communications breakdown within Iran. Leadership paths are unclear at this point. The chain of command has been annihilated. So it can be difficult to tell who's exactly in authority, whether the president is talking to somebody who has the ability to make a deal. He's obviously talking to somebody on the Iranian side right now, and hopefully we'll get some clarity sooner rather than later. The person that everybody had kind of pegged was the Iranian parliament speaker. He came out with a statement a couple hours ago saying we haven't had any talks with the United States, himself included, and so the mystery continues here. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke with Vice President J.D. Vance a short time ago, as reported by our sister station, I-24 News Hebrew. Vance reportedly might get thrown into the mix here as the negotiator because of a lack of trust between the Iranians and lead negotiator from the U.S. side, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Remember, Witkoff, along with Jared Kushner, have been at the negotiating table twice with the Iranians, where hours after they left the table, President Trump struck Iran, first the nuclear facilities last year and then launching the conflict this year. So J.D. Vance may be up. Whether that portends good news or bad news for Israel remains to be seen. But again, the biggest question right now, who is President Trump actually speaking with?
Right. And, I'm interested to hear what you're hearing on the ground in terms of responses to what Trump is saying, especially regarding, this deal that's potentially involving enriched uranium and nuclear limits. If something like that were to materialize, Would this war be deemed as having been won by the administration and also the American public?
Certainly so. If it goes to that level, there is a lot of skepticism, and rightfully so, around those particular claims because, again, Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz closed right now and still able to fire off missiles, and now we're finding out with the attack on the Diego Garcia base, quite possibly has a bigger collection of long-range missiles than was ever imagined, isn't really in a position right now to start making concessions that they never were going to make to begin with in terms of completely wiping out their nuclear enrichment, a couple of other things that the president claimed today. The truth probably lies, or the accuracy probably lies somewhere in the middle. Of course, if President Trump got everything that he's been asking for all along, I think everybody, other than the most skeptical of people, would declare it a victory. But that just seems so far-fetched at this point. It seems like maybe this is a starting point for talks rather than something that has been agreed upon by somebody with the actual, juice to get something done in the end.
All right, that's Mike Wagenheim joining us from the White House. Now, just as Washington was talking diplomacy, the battlefield was talking something very different. Minutes after President Donald Trump announced what he called productive talks with Iran, Israel launched a fresh wave of airstrikes deep inside Tehran. The IDF says it targeted the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' main internal security headquarters, a key command hub used to coordinate regime control in the besieged paramilitary forces. Israeli officials say the site was embedded in civilian infrastructure and that steps were taken to reduce harms to civilians. The timing, of course, is striking here. While the U.S. signals a possible diplomatic off-ramp, Israel appears to be doubling down on military pressure. We're going to be turning now to our guest, Dr. Walid Fares, who is joining us. He's a foreign policy expert and the author of Future Jihad, and he's in D.C. as well. You know, this strike came just minutes after President Trump spoke about possible talks with Tehran. Do you see this as coordinated pressure designed to strengthen diplomacy or evidence of diverging strategies between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, no matter what, basically, if two allies have a diverging angle like the British and the United States during World War II, it happened many times. Despite that, if there is any ceasefire, any agreement to start to settle, you're not going to see it on the battlefield, even if it's true, even if the connections at this point in time is happening. It would take always time for strikes and raids and operations to slow down and then finish. But in my perspective, I see that signs are not here yet that the Islamic regime in Iran is preparing for a major change, because this is not going to be about ceasefire. It's going to be about, as the president mentioned, settlement of the issue. We would have seen signs and signals from the regime or the lower level of the regime at this point in time, a la Gorbachev, meaning somebody should go and address the Iranian public in general, or at least the base of the Khomeini regime, by saying we are preparing ourselves for negotiations, we are preparing ourselves for settlement. All the voices that we hear right now are that we're not accepting yet any offer from the United States.
Dr. Fares, what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that Iran is denying the comments from Trump that talks are already underway?
If both sides make concessions, because remember, the United States will have to make a concession, which is not to continue for the dismantling of the regime. That's a big concession, meaning we're going to be telling the regime, okay, we stop our operations against you, but what are you giving us? We are in that period right now, 2-3 days, so that the president will realize if this is something worth it to sign or to have an agreement about. In my view, the regime is so weak and knows that eventually with the U.S. and Israeli strikes, it is going to collapse eventually. So they are saving themselves. And I imagine that the discussion within the command in the regime is that what can we do to gain time, even if we want to sign off on many things for now. That's how they have operated for the last many decades.
Right. Of course, I want to talk about specifically the comments that Trump made, saying that, or basically responding to a question about who would control the Strait of Hormuz should some deal be signed. And he said it would be himself and whatever Ayatollah ends up taking over the Islamic Republic. How do you think that's being received by the Iranian diaspora, the Iranian public, who have been under the impression that the United States, really stepped into this war following the mass protests and slaughtering of civilians speaking up against the regime?
From my contacts, first, of course, within the NGOs working inside Iran, and of course, the leadership of the transitional government and all the opposition forces on the outside, they are waiting. So all what was said by the president is that there is a possibility for a deal. And a deal could go as bad as the Obama deal, in my view, or as good as transferring power. I suggested in a tweet an hour ago that any deal, the only deal that could be logical at this point in time, otherwise the regime will go back to its previous policies, is a deal, a transition to a transition. If the president feels comfortable with the speaker of the parliament in Iran, that speaker will hand over the power agencies to the opposition, to the transitional government, will be fine with it. The problem, we don't have yet an official declaration by the United States of what is and who is the transitional government.
Right, but this is under the assumption that ideology is not what's driving the Islamic Republic, and that seems to have been kind of a fundamental misunderstanding that we've seen, at least verbalized by Trump, the lack of understanding as to why this, regime was not willing to come to the table and negotiate. Is there a world in which there would be somebody within the government right now? Obviously, we know of those who are left, they're still hardliners, that would be willing to hand over power to the opposition?
That's the mother of all questions. I don't believe so, but if there is a system now or a tactic, I would call it tactic, that they will have used in the past, which is to deceive, taqiyya, as it's called in many places in the Middle East, then they will go for it. I mean, yes, it's ideological. Yes, they want to create a caliphate-like imamate. That we know. Mm-hmm. But for them, they need to survive as a regime to be able to do it. So the price they will be paying may be very long and thick price, but the only thing they cannot do is transfer power actually to the people, to the families of the people they killed. Remember, now we are after the killing of 50,000, 40,000, whatever the number is. So that is going to be very difficult for the opposition on the inside and the diaspora and the transitional government to accept such a deal without the one thing they want, which is the regime should leave. So it is very difficult.
Final quick question for you, Dr. Faris, is really about Hezbollah in Lebanon right now. Obviously, they've been the Islamic Republic's strongest proxy group. We've seen them significantly weakened following years now of Israeli strikes since October 7th, or I should say October 8th. My question for you is, at this point, is there any coming back for this proxy group, given the fact that the Islamic Republic is also being tackled so intensely by both the United States and Israel?
Hezbollah is in a very difficult, extremely strategic, negative position. They are leaving the south of the Litani. They're trying to go towards Beirut. All communities in Beirut said, no, we don't want you there. Their only option is go to the northern Bekaa. So that's not something easy. But what is missing is a role for the Lebanese army. The heads of the Lebanese army and of the government have not yet given any instructions to actually starting the process of disarming Hezbollah. And that's a problem for the process in Lebanon.
Right. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. As per usual, great to have you on the show. We're going to turn now to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry, and our senior diplomatic correspondent, Owen Alterman, who are here in the studio with us. Obviously, we are hearing starkly different messaging from the United States and from the Islamic Republic of Iran when it comes to potential negotiations on the table. What is going on here, Owen?
Obviously, Natasha, there's a lot behind the scenes, but what we know is what Donald Trump's messaging is, which is he's selling this as a big victory, as Donald Trump always does a 180-degree U-turn, and then with all of his enthusiasm and all of his charm, goes before the cameras and talks about all of the achievements of the war, first on his way to Memphis from Palm Beach Airport, where he was coming out from Mar-a-Lago, and then at the event in Memphis itself just a couple of hours ago, talking about all the achievements of the war, what the United States has done. Nicole, in a sense, summing up the war as if it were to end tomorrow, what the United States has achieved. And from Iran's perspective, at first saying there are no talks, because why would we talk? We need to punish the enemy. And now telling Al Jazeera that there actually have been some messages passed through mediators like Turkey and Egypt. Mm-hmm. And again, a potential summit on the way, according to reporting, including from our sister Hebrew channel and across Israeli media. In terms of how this is being received in Israel, for example, in the 7 o'clock hour and panels on television shows, some question about what's behind this. Is this a trick that Donald Trump is using to help lower the price of oil and help the stock markets move up while giving himself time to bring Marines to the arena in the Middle East? and then be able to attack? Or is there some kind of real talk? So some skepticism in Israel and a kind of wait and see attitude. I think at the end of the day, Natasha, as I've said in our broadcasts over the course of the day, I think if the war were to end today, it would be within the range of expectations that Israelis would have had before the war. Again, on one hand, having a trust in Donald Trump. On the other hand, interesting because, as we both know, we're living in a post-October 7th world where we know there aren't quick and easy solutions. Not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, and it turns out not in Iran. And for that reason, it won't change Israel's strategic position in the Middle East for better or worse, and won't change Benjamin Netanyahu's political fortunes heading into elections.
Yeah, we'll get to that shortly. And we'll also get to what we just saw happen with the oil markets. You spoke about the kind of economic fallout here. I want to turn to you, Dan Perry. I also saw you kind of shaking your head in response to, I guess, the idea that Israelis would believe if the war were to end at this moment that that was what should have been expected, you could say. I would say my feeling is from the many analysts and guests and people that I meet on the street that the Israeli expectation at this point is that this is the war of all wars, the war that is going to end the Islamic Republic. And if that is not achieved, is this going to be deemed a major failure for the Israeli government? And what are we hearing from Israeli officials on this?
You know, Israel's divided, and some people will say it's a big victory, and others will not. And this is a case where if the war ends today, everyone can claim victory, and in all cases, it will be with a degree of plausibility. The victory that Netanyahu would surely claim would mirror what Trump would say, which is that they have been set back spectacularly. I mean, when you kill their leader and most of his adjutants and destroy so much of their military and their infrastructure, and very clearly their ability to strike at Israel, and quite possibly their willingness to flirt with more conflict against Israel and an America that has now crossed the Rubicon and is willing to attack them directly, probably is diminished. So I think to say that Israel's strategic position is the same as it was is wrong. I mean, Israel can claim that it has achieved a lot, even without having received what it really wants. And Trump will say the same. Of course, Trump would sell anything to anyone, and this is sellable. As for the Iranians, it's a little bit sad when you've been thrashed so badly and you can somehow say we've won because we're somehow still barely standing. It's pathetic, but they will. And to their acolytes, that will work. So when it's a win-win-win for everyone, you can kind of tell that there's going to be some momentum in that direction now. It seems to be a contradiction where Trump says there's been talks and the Iranians say there haven't been. These are two parties that have a tenuous connection to the truth at the best of times, especially during the fog of war. But in this case, I'm inclined to bet that Trump is the more truthful, simply because no one can say who's in charge in Iran right now. Obviously, there very probably are competing spheres of influence as the regime tries to figure out what to do next. And Trump is very likely exchanging messages with someone or other. The big question is what he will agree to accept for an end to the war. If it's only restrictions on and even a cancellation of the nuclear program, that would be a wasted opportunity. And then no matter how set back the Iranians have been, in Israel, there will be a lot of bitterness about how they went through all this hassle and inconvenience and sacrifice. And again, they only got back to where the JCPOA was under Obama in 2015.
Right. I mean, quite frankly, it's hard for me to believe that the Israeli public will be okay with this war ending right now, because there seems to be the general perception that it is not going to be a true success unless the Islamic regime falls, because ultimately they're just going to rebuild themselves and continue to attack and rearm the proxy groups that, like Hezbollah, for one, that have been attacking Israel. But I do want to talk about something, and you know, that is the markets. We saw them already moving before the news actually broke. We actually saw just minutes before President Donald Trump announced these surprise talks with Iran, huge stock futures and bet against oils. I mean, essentially, traders were suddenly piling up into stock futures in this bet against oil. And then, of course, we saw Brent crude plunge by 9% after that announcement. What does that tell us about Trump's strategy right now? And is this a shocker to anybody?
Well, Trump loves his metrics, and in particular his stock market. So I can tell you the Dow Jones is up by 2% today. And Trump takes credit for that, and of course does not take the blame for when it falls. I think Trump is very happy that if oil comes down a little bit, which it probably will, if the war ends, and if the market is buoyed.
But does this point to the idea that perhaps, you know, that was one of the goals here? Maybe this was just about, you know, playing with the market a little bit, easing the pressure when it comes to the prices of oil, and then going back to, square one,
Natasha,
continuing this war.
Anyone who tells you they know why Trump did something is a charlatan. What is clear is that Trump wants to emerge a winner and not a loser. If he can build a narrative where that is plausible in the least, then there's a chance that he would do it. And certainly he looks like a winner in his own eyes and much of his base if the metrics go in the right direction, even temporarily. And by the way, we were betting on everything these days. Don't be surprised if some people made significant fortunes on the rise and fall of these markets.
Right. Any last comments on that, Owen?
Well, beyond the oil markets, just to talk a bit about politics in Israel, Natasha, it might surprise some viewers that at 8:07 tonight, Israel's Channel 14, again, affiliated with the political right here, put out a tweet or push notification about Yair Lapid talking about civil marriage and public transportation on Shabbat. Natasha, what I'm trying to say is that for all of the focus on geopolitics and security and the balance of power in the Middle East, some of the issues, even tonight, even right now, even with the crush of news in the last few hours, the issues that really mobilize big parts of the Israeli public have nothing to do with any of this. And as we look ahead to our election campaign, for all of us to keep in mind, this may well not be an election campaign about any of this, but instead about an entirely different set of issues that even in the heat of the action of the Iran war and all that's at stake around the world, this is what Israeli media are talking about.
If the Iranian regime falls, then Bibi will make it about that, and he will benefit. Anything less than that, he may try, but it may not move the needle.
All right, guys, we're going to turn to Israel's northern border with Lebanon. At least 3 people have been injured after a Hezbollah strike hit the border city of Kiryat Shmona, sending shrapnel flying and emergency crews scrambling. 2 of the wounded suffered injuries to the face and limbs after we saw shrapnel actually strike a bus. Here you can see in these images just a little bit of what took place. Another man in his 30s was airlifted to Haifa for further treatment. At the same time, Iran has launched 3 missile barrages at Israel since midnight, triggering sirens across central Israel and causing damage in several locations. I'd like to turn to our correspondent Balir Sladin, who joins us from central Israel. Give us some updates as to what we're seeing in terms of the amount of missile fire from both Iran and Hezbollah. Overall, we are seeing fewer launches than we saw yesterday.
Yes, when it comes to Iran. After all, this would be actually the calmest day since the beginning of the war. The last time that we have heard sirens here in the area of the center of Israel was actually yesterday's midnight. I mean, this is almost 24 hours without any sirens, but there has been sirens this morning in the southern parts of south of Israel, actually south of the center, not south of Israel, meaning in Rehovot, in the area of the Shifla. And there has been damage caused by the cluster munition bomb that Iran has fired toward that area. But here in the center, meaning Tel Aviv and the towns or cities around it, there hasn't been sirens since yesterday's midnight. And when it comes to Hezbollah and the front in the north, the things are absolutely different. There has been several barrages of missiles toward the Israeli northern communities, including, of course, those that are right on the border. And as you've mentioned, the incident today in Kiryat Shmona, when a barrage of missiles actually impacted 2 different sites in Kiryat Shmona. In one of them, that rocket fall in front of a bus. And as a result of that, the driver of the bus has been severely injured. He's hospitalized and was taken to the hospital, of course, and he's in a severe condition. 2 more people are in a mild condition. One of them is suffering from anxiety symptoms. And the firing from Hezbollah has continued also until the last few hours, including drone attacks that activated sirens also in the Western Galilee and different parts of the Israeli north. Now, there is another development happening in the north, and it is 2 Hezbollah operatives from the Radwan elite unit being taken or imprisoned by the Israeli forces. That incident happened actually yesterday. The 91 division that was operating deep inside southern Lebanon has tried to capture an area and destroy the infrastructure that Hezbollah has built in it. And on that occasion, two Hezbollah operatives were planning to fire an anti-tank missile, something that they routinely do against Israeli soldiers there. But because of the enormous amount of power and fire that the Israeli army, including from drones that operated in that area, they surrendered, they raised their hands, and they were taken captive by the Israeli forces, and they are now being interrogated inside Israel. Those are not the first ones that are taken captive by the Israeli side, but those are the first from or since the beginning of this actually war. There were several others during the past war, and they are still in Israeli prisons. By the way, one of the goals of Hezbollah after initiating these attacks against Israel about a couple of weeks ago was actually to free their prisoners, but now they're getting two more prisoners to the list in Israel.
All right. I'd like to thank you for that update. Balir Saladin joining us from Central Israel. We're going out for a quick commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back here on I-24 News.
Tired of the hassle and high costs of selling a home? We can help. At Ideal Agent, we'll connect you with a top local agent that'll sell your home fast for top dollar, and all this for as low as a 2% commission.
We got the top dollar for our house and the lowest commission that I could have imagined. The house sold in 2 days. It was so exciting for us.
Ideal Agent is available nationwide, there's no obligation, and best of all, our service is completely free. Call today or visit idealagent.com.
We planned well for retirement, but I wish we had more cash.
You think those two have any idea
that they can sell their life insurance policy for cash, so they're basically sitting on a gold mine? I don't think they have a clue.
That's crazy.
Well, not everyone knows Coventry's helped thousands of people sell their policies for cash, even term policies.
I can't believe they're just sitting up there.
Sitting on all this cash.
If you own a life insurance policy of $100,000 or more, you can sell all or part of it to Coventry, even a term policy, for cash or a combination of cash and coverage with no future premiums.
Someone needs to tell them that they're sitting on a gold mine and you have no idea. Hey guys, you're sitting on a gold mine!
Do you hear that?
I don't hear anything anymore.
Find out if you're sitting on a gold mine. Call Coventry Direct today at 800-967-4700 or visit coventrydirect.com.
Dance, music, and magic immerse you in the story of Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem, an unforgettable musical where the past and present meet. Welcome to the heart of the most sought-after city in the world. A unique experience only at Kikar HaMusika. Reserve now at thisisjerusalem.co.il.
Some people buy property. We identify opportunities. David Jamie Group, experience dedicated to those who choose to invest differently. Today, Dubai is booming. Exceptional growth, favorable taxation, unmatched security, and returns unlike anywhere else in the world. Surrounded by top-tier experts, we search on the ground and alongside you for the most promising opportunities in Dubai, but also in Miami, Tel Aviv, and Paris. Want to invest smart? Secure your future in the world's most iconic cities? David Jamie Group, real estate opportunities.
When Israel is under fire, the world watches. But we act. Since 1901, Jewish National Fund USA has stood with our homeland. From the moment missiles rained down, we were there, caring for children of essential workers, turning shelters into sanctuaries, providing fire trucks and more. Israel is our family, and you always show up for family. To support the people of Israel for today and tomorrow, turn to the trusted name in philanthropy, Jewish National Fund USA.
And we're back on I-24 News. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us and sticking with us. Well, inside Iran itself, questions remain over the likelihood of an uprising against the regime, the timing of such a response. The New York Times is now reporting that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had embraced a Mossad plan to spark a popular uprising at the start of the Iran war, and is reportedly frustrated that this has not happened. The report, published on Sunday, cites current and former U.S. and Israeli officials who say that the Israeli Prime Minister had discussed the plan with President Donald Trump ahead of the war. Those officials reportedly now view the chances of regime change with skepticism amidst fears of a repeat of January's brutal crackdown on demonstrators and danger from the military campaign. And joining us now is Navid Mohebi. He's an Iranian-American analyst joining us from Washington, D.C. So I can only imagine that today has been a bit of a roller coaster ride for you and most Iranians living around the world. My question for you, following these reports that, Trump has essentially been in talks with Iran, even saying something along the lines of jointly running the Strait of Hormuz with the next Ayatollah if a deal is signed. How is that being received by the Iranian public?
Thank you for having me on. Definitely, this is not something that Iranian people want. I'm concerned that some of the stuff that we are hearing in the news are not necessarily legitimate, and we don't know for sure that such meetings has ever happened. Iranian regime outlets deny that Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf engaged with Trump administration or had any negotiation over the ongoing war. But I can tell you that, just 2 months ago, Iranians took to the street and more than 36,000 people were killed. And Trump started this war because of that, because he promised Iranians that there will be a change. So I don't think that Iranians will accept any deal that throw them under the bus. Yes, there are not so much options for Iranian people left to deal with such scenario. But I would expect that if such a thing happens, Iranians will take back to the street again and continue fighting the regime. But in terms of the New York Times report, I also have my doubt on that. Because I think Israel totally understand under what conditions Iranian people will get back to the street again. The Iranian regime still fully dominates the streets. There are checkpoints everywhere. Regime masked gunmen are marching in the street. So the Israeli government, hasn't actually concentrated on eliminating the checkpoints and regime guns on the street. So we are far from it, but the war is not over. I'm expecting that over the next few weeks, Israel will accelerate its targeting of Iranian regime militant men in the street, and then it will create a condition for Iranians to go back to the street.
Navid, if in fact, though, we do see some type of deal that is reached with the Islamic Republic, which would see, some type of interim Ayatollah that would be deemed acceptable by the United States president, how would that ultimately be received? Because there is a chance that that could happen. At the end of the day, we did hear Trump, make comments that he was coming to the rescue of the Iranian protesters who had been, rising up against the regime. But ultimately, there are many other interests, many other geopolitical interests right now at play.
I also think that Israel will not accept any type of deal that allows the remnants of the regime to stay in place. Because what we have learned from this regime is that when it is under pressure, they try to be pragmatic, they engage in negotiations, they try to cool down the tensions. That buys them time. That buys them time and allow them to regroup. And they're also hoping that by waiting out the Trump administration, the next administration will be less hawkish and they can continue their destabilizing behavior in the region. The issue that we are dealing with the Iranian regime is trust. they have always, used to say that our ballistic missile range is only 2,000 kilometers. But we saw 2 days ago that they targeted, Garcia Island. Yes, which is like almost 4,100 kilometers away. So how can you trust the Iranian regime? That's the real question. That's why I think that even though the U.S. government may engage in negotiation with the regime, which is understandable, but other actors will not necessarily be in support of allowing the Iranian regime to continue its existence in any shape or form.
Well, there is certainly no question that the continuation of the Islamic regime poses a major threat to the state of Israel. And so you are correct in saying that it would be very difficult for Israel to end this war without seeing the collapse of the regime for its long-term security interests. But ultimately, the question is, how much power Israel has in the face of U.S. President Donald Trump and his decision-making. What is the Iranian public at this point? What are you hearing, at least, from Iranians on the ground amid this, widespread blackout that we're seeing in terms of where they believe the power lies?
Iranians understand that this war has multiple stakeholders. One is Israel and one is United States. They also understand that the actor that is targeting regimes' repressive centers, the actor that is targeting Tehran and usually north of Iran is mainly the state of Israel. So they understand that, how Israel and, United States had labor division in terms of dealing with the government of Iran. And they also understand that these two sides have different vision for the future of Iran. So I would say that they are hoping that Israel will play a more positive role for them and allow the Iranian people to take their country back. So they're eyeing on Israel for a positive outcome.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Navid, for joining us. Very interesting to hear the Iranian perspective. Obviously, still very difficult to, get into contact with people on the ground at this time, but we're going to have to see how these alleged negotiations play out. We have an update for you right now from the IDF. The Israeli military says that the Israeli air defense system that failed to shoot down 2 Iranian ballistic missiles in southern cities just about 2 days ago now, that would be Dimona and Arad on Saturday night, was actually a medium-range David's sling mistake. According to the Israeli Air Force, what we're seeing right now after probes of this incident, there was no connection between the actual errors that led to those missile impacts, which, injured a total of almost 200 people in southern Israel and caused extensive damage. Obviously, the fact that the incidents occurred in the same area, they're saying, was just entirely coincidental. It's important to know that the missiles that struck in Dimona and Arad were actually conventional warheads. They were not cluster warheads, which means that they were carrying hundreds of kilograms of explosives, hence the mass damage that we saw in the mass injuries. The David sling system had tried to engage both of these projectiles, according to the IDF, but its interceptors failed to knock them down. In total, this has happened 4 times since the start of the war. We know that around 940 ballistic missiles were fired by the Islamic Republic of Iran at the state of Israel. About 370 of them made their way into Israeli airspace. The vast majority either intercepted, shot down, or falling into open areas. It is, of course, important to remember that what we saw take place in the southern Israeli cities of Dimona and Arad were the 3rd and 4th incidents of ballistic missiles directly striking areas in Israel. I want to turn now to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry, and our senior diplomatic correspondent, Owen Alterman. So, obviously, very, very interesting what we're seeing right now, kind of the lack of ballistic missile launches today from Iran, just 3 since midnight. This is much calmer than what we've seen in recent days. And of course, now this announcement by Trump that there are talks with Iran has everybody wondering if this could perhaps be a coincidence. At this point, what do we know about the damage that has actually been made on the Islamic Republic's military assets and how strong the regime is from a military standpoint?
Look, in terms of damage numbers, Natasha, I think we can recite them in our sleep, right? 90% of the launches, decline in the launches. What, 80, 90% of the missile launchers destroyed, B-2 bombers used to try to get at those underground storage facilities for ballistic missiles. So according to the press conferences, a lot of damage has been done. Of course, the two questions that remain are, number one, how much is left? What is the number that was started with, and how much damage can that still cause? And the most important question, the day after this war, assuming the regime is still in place, how long will it take for Iran to rebuild? We heard after the June war that it would take, 2 years, according to the intelligence assessments, for the Iranians to rebuild? It wasn't 2 years. It was much less. Now, much more damage has been done. We've heard from Benjamin Netanyahu in his appearances before the camera that Israel struck much more at the defense industrial complex in Iran, not just at the facilities to make the missiles, but the facilities that made the parts, implying that it will take a lot more time and be a lot more expensive for the Iranians to rebuild. That's going to be the big question.
Right. The IDF now says that it's destroyed or at least disabled around 330 of Iran's 470 missile launchers. It certainly feels, throughout the wars that we've seen since October 7th, especially after the last 12-day war in June, that the so-called existential threat had been eliminated from Iran. That was at least the messaging that Israelis heard from the government. At this point, obviously, it is certainly welcomed, this, decrease we're seeing in missile launches. But do you think the Israeli public is going to be satisfied with the war ending at this point?
Some will, some won't. If the war ends with the regime in place and none of the conditions agreed to, then many more people will not be satisfied. If it ends just with another limitation on the nuclear file, then the number moves over a little bit. If the war ends with Iran agreeing to what I hope will be presented to them if talks are going on, which I think they will be going on, as absolutely rock-solid demands that it end the militia program, that it end the ballistic missile program, and that it end the nuclear program, then I think the Israelis will be quite satisfied, even if the regime stays in place. Now, I would hope that Trump would approach these talks from a position of strength. He should indeed consider that he has a position of strength, no matter how fanatical, no matter how suicidal the leaders of Iran might be. And I don't think they're that suicidal, many of them at least. Pezeshkian is not suicidal. No matter how crazy they may be, probably they understand now something that they didn't understand a few months ago, which is that the U.S. is willing to go to war. And they may agree to seriously limit their activities on all three fronts, the missiles, the militias, and the nukes, in exchange for survival. I would want the Americans to add other conditions as well, domestic reforms, as we heard some of the other guests suggesting might be achievable. Maybe demand an end to the clerical vetting of presidential candidates. Maybe re-empower the Iranian parliament. If not actually hand over to the opposition, that's extremely unlikely. That's a total defeat. But to demand an end to the missiles, nukes, and militias, as well as the beginnings of some domestic reforms, that would be a spectacular victory. Is it achievable? Right. I fear Trump may not have the staying power. All
right, we're going to turn now to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's just released his first statement since Trump's announcement about talks with Iran. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Earlier today, I spoke with our friend, President Trump. President Trump believes that there is a chance to leverage the achievements of the IDF and the U.S. military to realize the war goals in the agreement, an agreement that will protect our vital interests. At the same time, we continue to attack both Iran and Lebanon. We are crushing the missile program and the nuclear program to the core, and we continue to severely harm Hezbollah. A few days ago, we eliminated 2 more nuclear scientists, and the hand is still outstretched. We will protect our vital interests in any situation.
All right, let's turn to our senior diplomatic correspondent, Owen Alterman, on this. What do you make of these comments? What are the highlights here?
Well, first of all, beyond the words, Natasha, the aesthetics, right? We don't see the books on the bookshelf. We don't see Netanyahu at the desk. We see him in what almost looks like a bunker, right? He's in fighting mode. You can see it with his body language, in determination mode. And what's the subtext here is he knows people will be skeptical about this. He's there to reassure and to show the public, or show his base in particular, that he's there and that Israel is still fighting, and Israel's essential interests will be safeguarded. Meaning, again, I think a bit of lowering expectations. And going back to what Dan was saying before, look, I think beyond the bullet points of what the agreement looks like, there's this phrase in Hebrew, it's almost untranslatable to English, tmunat nitzachon, the picture of victory, the emotional sense that your side has come out on top. And that, I agree with you, Natasha, is what's going to be missing. But I think we have to distinguish between whether the public will be satisfied with the results versus what the public expected from the results. I think, especially in a post-October 7th world, this is a public that doesn't necessarily expect to be satisfied, which is why I think this will not necessarily change the way Israelis look at their country, at their own security, at their own lives, and at their politics, and for that matter, at their prime minister.
I respectfully have to disagree. I think the picture of victory already exists, and that is the assassination of Khamenei and so many of his adjutants. If the Israelis want to declare victory and to say, well, we've achieved something, it's more or less that. And I would also note, it's unprecedented. I can't think of another state actor that assassinated the head of state of another country in recent modern history. The crossing of that kind of Rubicon, that kind of daring, some would say that kind of recklessness, is spectacular. And regular people who aren't used to thinking like fanatics would have to conclude that even if the Iranians continue with their bluster, they're going to think twice before taking on Israel and the Americans once more. But that is the Israeli narrative to victory. But by one thing,
I'm just not sure that the Israeli public buys that.
But there is no Israeli public.
Israel has killed lots of leaders since October 7th, only to see that the organizations are still there. I don't know that people are going to make a distinction whether it's Khamenei or a state-like actor like Hezbollah and Nasrallah. The point being, but again, I think the public didn't necessarily expect to be satisfied.
I don't know the Israeli public. I know there are but 10 and some million Israelis, and they're usually divided, and the Israeli public decides one way or the other based on a shift of 2 or 3% among them.
And polls have shown that the numbers haven't moved, at least in terms of voting intentions,
that's
which
true.
is a reasonable proxy at this point in how people feel about
this
the
war.
achievements
Ultimately, support for this
war.
They
all support the war.
Right, because they're, again, going back to the fall of the Islamic regime, I think it's really hard. The expectation was pretty much set by Netanyahu at the start of this war.
And by the facts. The killing of Khamenei and so many of his lieutenants on the first day suggested that indeed a regime collapse might happen. And frankly, I still think it's possible, not necessarily right now.
I agree with that completely.
So I mean, look, I have lived long enough to be in the Soviet Union before it collapsed. And it looked less collapsible than this looks now.
Right.
There's a better example.
I can hardly think.
There's a better example.
Country that is so rife for collapse.
Serbia.
One sentence. Serbia. Spring of 1999, 78-day air campaign by NATO. Vis-a-vis Kosovo. Of course, there wasn't the goal of toppling the regime, but 16 months later, a popular revolution, a color revolution, led to the end of the regime. Again, there may be some connection between them, maybe a precedent.
All right, guys. We're going to have to talk about the Gulf right now. We'll come back to you shortly. You know, just as talk of diplomacy began to surface today, explosions and air raid sirens were reported in Bahrain, and blasts were also heard in Kuwait, marking the first strikes in the Gulf since President Donald Trump announced possible talks with Iran. Authorities in Bahrain urged residents to stay calm and head to shelters as fears grow that the conflict could spill even further across the region's energy and security infrastructure. And joining us now is Zineb Riboua. She's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. How significant is it that Gulf states like Bahrain and Kuwait are now hearing explosions and sirens? And what does this suggest about Iran's strategy at this stage of the war, especially after these comments by Trump that there are negotiations?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think that actually the IRGC is falling into a big strategic trap. I think they're making several mistakes. And obviously, they're not aware of them because their chain of command has been completely destroyed and broken. They don't know who is calling for what and who is talking to whom. And this really shows in their sporadic and absolutely chaotic reactions. In fact, they are hitting the very countries that have been very open with them, that had diplomatic diplomatic channels with them. They don't understand that actually one of the cards they had was actually to have the Arab Street to be able to speak in the name of, what they would call the resistance axis against Israel and the United States. Well, that's just not happening anymore. They're hitting every single neighbor, and that's absolutely a significant, I think, development that just means how isolated they are.
Right. I want to talk about that. We've seen analysts, yourself, you've, argued that Tehran has long relied on kind of mobilizing the Arab Street as a strategic asset. Do these attacks ultimately risk undermining that approach? Has Gulf public opinion ultimately been turned against Iran to the point that we could see these countries become closer with Israel, for one?
Well, yes, I absolutely think so, in the sense that, first of all, people in the Middle East are absolutely sick of, I think, what the IRGC has been doing for a very long time. In Lebanon, in Syria, all these countries are hostages of the Islamic Republic chaos. People want investment, they want business, they want really to look after their own environment and their own society. So that's the first one. The second is that it's obviously not helpful, because you can see now Gulf countries, and I think the UAE made a very interesting statement about how they're not going to get blackmailed by the IRGC. The UAE is very important because they also kept diplomatic channels with Iran. And so obviously you can see that with Saudi Arabia, also brokered a normalization deal with Iran in Beijing. They have been very vocal about how Iran's aggression is hurting not just Saudi Arabia, but the whole region. So I believe that we can see already how this has been translating into the diplomatic, I think, messaging of Gulf countries. But I also think that this is, I think, a very important development for the United States itself. It means that the United States is going after not just its interests, not just after, dismantling nuclear or missiles, but also after the whole region. And I think that this really is an important development.
I want to talk about what we're hearing from Gulf countries in regards more specifically to Trump's statements now that there are negotiations ongoing with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Are these negotiations, if they are in fact real, supported by Gulf Arab states? And if so, who's supporting them the most? And are there any countries that would like to see continued military strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran at this point?
I think that all Gulf countries want this to end with basically an Iran that is not hostile, which means an Iran that does not have the IRGC as its power structure. So I think that this is very important to keep in mind. There are several reports suggesting that Gulf countries are pressing the Trump administration to just finish the job and go all in. So whether a deal is happening or not, whether a negotiation is happening or not, it seems that all the direction points toward having an Iran that is not able and that is no longer the aggressor and no longer threatens its neighbors. So I think that this is very important to keep in mind, because I think whether negotiations succeed in a way we think about them, at the end of the day, what Trump really wants is, as he says, make Iran great again, which means an Iran that is no longer under the Islamic Republic or the Ayatollah or the IRGC.
All right, Zineb, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting to hear your insight. We're turning now to new flight restrictions in Israel that have locals scrambling. Israel, as we said last night, is sharply scaling back flights out of Ben Gurion Airport as Iranian missile threats continue, slashing the number of passengers who are allowed on departing planes to 50 from 120 and cutting takeoffs and landings in half. But that's not all. Right now, there are only 4 Israeli airlines that are actually operating in and out of Ben Gurion Airport. But some of these carriers are now shifting flights to nearby airports in Egypt and Jordan, while others say that there's simply no real way to maintain normal operations. Arkia Airlines, for one, is shifting its long-haul operations to Taba and Aqaba in Egypt and Jordan, while El Al has now said that it's going to be limiting its flights out of Tel Aviv to 7 destinations. Those will be New York, Los Angeles, Miami, London, Paris, Rome, and Athens. The Israeli airline Israel now says it's going to have to limit its flight operations to 5 destinations. That will be Athens, Larnaca, Rome, Tbilisi in Georgia, and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So I'd like to turn back to our guests in the studio. Owen, just for a quick comment on this. You know, I think this is one of the first times that we are seeing such severe restrictions on Ben Gurion Airport. How are Israelis reacting to this, and what does this tell us about the conflict at this point?
Look, obviously there are higher priorities right now for most of the public, Natasha, but you can't ignore the fact that people have Pesach vacations planned for their families and want to go on them. I think what's new here is the number of flights that are going to be taking off from Taba and from Aqaba. Taba across the Egyptian border and the Sinai, and Aqaba across the Jordanian border. And the idea that these airlines are going to be using those airports significantly, it's a new chapter, I think, in Israeli travel for mass numbers of Israelis to be flying out of those airports. And also, it is different from past episodes that the situation is going on for this long at Israel's airports and the need for these restrictions. Right. It's difficult for people, again, even if there are items that are higher priority.
On the positive side, you can say that the cooperation with Jordan and Egypt as regards this matter is kind of heartwarming and a sign of maybe good things to come.
And the confidence that Israeli decision makers have in letting such large numbers of Israelis go through those borders and go onto those flights. Absolutely.
All right, my friends. Unfortunately, that is it for our broadcast. I'm Natasha Kirchuk. Thank you to our guests, Owen and Dan. We are going to see you next time. Stick with us. We're going to be live again on I-24 News at 10 p.m.